Everyone. Thank you very much for joining this MSDI research seminar, the last of the year, and what a year it has been. But one of the good things is that the seminar series actually was sort of forced to move online entirely, and that has actually, to some surprise, increased the number of participants in the seminar series. We had a few very successful ones, and as I said before, probably the timing of this one is slightly more challenging, but still pleased to see so many of you joining us today. And I'm also very pleased to introduce our speaker of today, João, Porto de Albuquerque. I will pronounce that right. I keep struggling with that, João, so apologize if that was not the best pronunciation. João is working at the University of Warwick, with which some of you might know, and the University of Monash also has a strategic alliance with. And at Warwick, João is professor and director of the Institute of Global Sustainable Development. That's sort of the MSDI equivalent, if you like, at the University of Warwick, although with a slightly shorter history. I think you guys were established about a year and a half ago, or 2 years ago. João is also a fellow at the Alan Turing Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence, and also co-directs the Warwick Institute for the Science of Cities. So you got a couple of interesting labels, I think, for much of the work that some of us are involved in as well. And I guess it's always challenging to introduce someone who has so many different kinds of backgrounds, but I think that's actually the thing that characterizes you, João. You are truly interdisciplinary. You combine techniques and approaches from various disciplines, including geography, computer science, geographical information systems, development studies, and so on and so forth. And next to being interdisciplinary, your work is also truly transdisciplinary. You work a lot with communities and try to empower marginalized voices in decision-making processes, using all those different kinds of capabilities that you are able to combine. I got to know João a couple of years ago, I guess, as part of the Monash Warwick Alliance exploratory project around the role of private actors in node system governance. And we continue to do another one, which also involves Jane, who's on the line here, and a few others on the Chitwan River. And we're currently exploring how we can collaborate that also in a follow-up project proposal. More generally, I think your skills and capabilities are very much complementary to some other projects going on at MSDI and Monash more generally. So I'm really keen and really happy, João, that you accepted the invitation to speak in this seminar series. Yeah, I'll leave it at that, João, and give the floor to yours.
Wonderful. Many thanks. Yeah, so can you hear me all right and see the slides? Just quick check. Okay. Yeah, great. So yeah, so good evening, everyone. Many thanks, Rob, for this kind introduction. And many thanks to all of you for being there. I realize it's not the optimal time, so we said you're cooking dinner and we are here in the breakfast. So it's one of the challenges with the time zone that we have to address for doing the partnership between Monash and Warwick. But notwithstanding, I do think it's a quite exciting partnership as well, or because of the complementarities now extended to complementarities in time zones as well. So yeah, so good evening, everyone. So I would like to talk today about something I've been researching since quite some time. So as Rob as introduced me, I come from a background in computer science, have moved into digital geography, with looking at geographic information and methods for using and producing geographic information has been a lot of my research, and with a particular focus on cities and urban environments specifically. Indeed, as you introduced it, Rob, since 2 years ago, I think I started the post of director of this new Institute for Global Sustainable Development in Warwick, which has a much shorter history than MSDI, but also some common links. Actually, it was Dave Griggs also who brought the idea to Warwick and initiated the institute movements, or the movements to create the institute here, and he came directly from Monash at that time. So yeah, so it's a really big pleasure for me to be speaking to you today, and many thanks for being there. I'll what I will talk today, I prepared the talk. I will try to be very conversational and try to hopefully engage a little bit in a dialogue in the end. So the talk will be centered on this, on the role of data in transformations to sustainability. So I'm really looking at this and asking the question about of whether this is bringing us towards inclusive and empowering resilience building, and particularly thinking about cities and urban resilience here. So the background for this talk is as you know, the use of, which is also part of this talk, in fact, is the use of digital technologies today. Also, like, from the background of COVID, has been quite intensified, isn't it? So we are using much more digital technologies. And this has also shown some potential of using this to be more resilient. For example, I can't fly to Melbourne to deliver this lecture or this talk to you, but we can still do it, and we can still exchange. And in fact, we have been exchanging very lively with the Monash team in the past few months, despite the challenge. And I think, given the potential of digital technologies. And I've brought here the Sustainable Development Goals report, because, in looking at this impact of the digital technologies in the SDGs, I think it's interesting to see. Of course, we have this big challenge now about, the pandemic has a multifarious impact in a number of countries, and threatening to reverse progress in important areas. But also, alongside this, an emphasis in re-emphasizing the digital revolution. So I was really interested to see in this in the SDG reports that the UN really was pushing for the pressing need for data innovations and for the strong use of digital technologies, because also the pandemic has shown that digital technology has potential, but also that we have huge and important problems to address in terms of data gaps. And that, I think, this two context is a bit of the background of my talk. So on the one hand, of course, we have digital revolution as a potential. We've been speaking about that since quite some years. And when I started working in this field, I directed a master's in urban analytics. And that's one of the programs that I had here in Warwick, in our Warwick Institute for the Science of Cities, which is, how can we harvest these new sources of data? So we have now sensors, we have now social media, we have now people, producing data in rates which are unprecedented, really. So we have data in a much more granular way from a series of data sources here. So we have here in the picture some drones. We have low-cost sensors, for example, which are deployed much more frequently. And this triggered a new or idea of what some colleagues, Mike Patty, my colleague from UCL, called the new science of cities, or the field of urban analytics, really. And particularly, I am particularly interested in this idea of citizen-generated data, which is, something which became possible. Everyone can now not only consume data, but also generate. So the generation of data became not only something that official agencies can do in the government, but also every one of us is doing in practice. And of course, the new technologies and new algorithms to kind of like to leverage the potential of this data include artificial intelligence, machine learning, to process this data and make sense of this data. So there is this side of things, which is the side of data being there, and there is the side which is actually which I like to use this map to show. This is a map which is actually a map of the OpenStreetMap, is a crowdsourced mapping, and it actually interestingly shows areas in which we have more data and less data. And I think it's a good picture to show and remind us about the the problems that we are talking about here. We are talking about also not only about data abundance and new data, but about lack of data as well at the same time. So with this, actually, I propose that, you know, to start the talk today, that actually we should think about this as a what I've been calling a genus-faced challenge of urban data. You know, so we have perhaps one more visible phase and more emphasized in the first part, which is the information overload, or, you know, the kind of like the big data side of things. So we have high volume data streams, unstructured data, the difficulty to process that, but also what we've seen quite a lot, isn't it, in social media today, variable credibility and quality of this information. So the problems of misinformation, the problem of disinformation and hoaxes, and now with COVID again kicking in very strongly, the hoaxes and the problems with credibility of this information. So this is what people usually call big data problem, isn't it? But what I'm proposing is that we have to see the other side of the coin, which is actually, you know, I'm using the Roman god Janus with the two faces. One perhaps in this picture is particularly good because one of them is a little bit less visible, and I think the information dearth is the other side of this two-faced problem here. And actually it happens at the same time as information overload. And that's the curious thing. So we have both. We have information overload and we have information dearth because we have lack of spatial and temporal coverage. Like we're seeing in the map, actually data is concentrated in some places, but there are others about which we know very little. And data is concentrated about some events, but there are many other times or many other situations about which we have much less data. So, and in addition to that, if data is not integrated into decision-making processes and tools, also kind of like this data, it doesn't become an information. So it's still an information dearth despite of, you know, existence of data. So there is a bit of a mismatch between needs and offers sometimes, that causes what we can call this, you know, this the twin problems, or the problem of information dearth. So that's what I would like to explore with you today, and in particular, based on this, you know, two-faced problem here, genus-faced problem, the genus-faced challenge, I would like to really explore with you the question I've been, you know, researching in a number of projects, which is really how can we think about data, and in this case specifically SDG data, so data for Sustainable Development Goals, as an opportunity also for empowerment and learning. So I'll bring a little bit about of ideas of research program that we have in Warwick related to this, and to discuss this question today. And I will do this really with and try to convey three key messages in this talk really. First, I will talk about inequalities, and I will talk about inequalities as being perhaps one of the main challenges when we're looking at SDG data innovations, and the use of data for development. And then I will do a case study, take one of our projects, which is called Waterproofing Data, which is about flooding and data for flooding in Brazil. And we'll talk to you as an example of how to tackle of these challenges, but also how we try to tackle these challenges, and then conclude with some takeaways and directions for future work. So with this, so starting with the first topic, really, inequalities, I think this picture for me, it's very telling, not only because it comes from São Paulo, my home country, Brazil, the city I lived in, I know well, and a city which is which is characterized by a lot of stark inequalities. They are social and spatial inequalities, and I think this picture shows here like side by side, you know, literally perhaps meters away, two very different realities, you know, a luxurious building on the right hand side, and on the left hand side what we could call a slum, or a very informal and poor neighborhood. And interestingly for me is when I started looking at this, is that these inequalities in cities and in society, they are reflected in data. And that's the first take away. Interestingly, I have some one map, the two maps. You know, as I said, I disclosed I'm a geographer and I love maps, and of course I brought a couple of maps today, and two I think are particularly interesting. This is the city of São Paulo. You know, you don't have to understand fully the geography of São Paulo, but you can look at monthly income distribution here, and you can very quickly recognize that is a radial distribution, very concentrated in some neighborhoods, and with a lot of poor neighborhoods in the peripheric areas of the city. And interestingly, we look at that the availability of data. With one source of data, and I will use this as a proxy for data in general here. We use the use of digital channels for citizens to communicate with the municipality, with the local government, and this is the map on the right hand side now. It's the use of digital channels. So you can see it matches quite well, or actually, you know, it's strongly correlated, and in fact is you know, statistically very strong correlation here between, you know, the use of digital means and monthly income. What does that mean? How much do we know about these areas in the peripheric areas? Probably not much. How much are they represented in the data? If we just take the data that come from the digital channels, you know, and there is a policy now in a lot of governance of doing digital by default, isn't it? So if we use digital by default, how much are we excluding from this city? So this is a big challenge, I think, for the data, so which I think is expressed here. Inequalities in cities, inequalities in the society are reflected in data inequalities. So that, and if we just use the data, just tap into the data of social media and of other big data sources, we'll be actually reproducing and accentuating biases in the society. And I think that is a key motivation for me to look at, you know, how data interacts with the SDGs. So we look at this, for example, and propose that these inequalities, we have to think about different types of inequalities, you know, the spatial inequalities, which is what I was showing in the map there, but also some more intersecting inequalities for like gender and other types of inequalities which are not necessarily distributed spatially. And of course, we have to think about their intersections, you know, between vertical, horizontal, and spatial inequalities here. But what I think is interesting here, we did a look at the SDG monitoring framework. You know, how do we know about progress that we are making towards development challenges, and we have to think about the data reflected here, both in the target definitions, in the indicator parameters and the data. So actually we have to think about, you know, inequalities in the different levels of how we think about development and how we measure and monitor development. And I think that's the key message here. So that inequalities are structural, and I think a big challenge for us to look at when we think about data innovations. And of course, part of this is related to informal settlements. As you know, like that's what I already started to talk about. You know, this is the problems with the unequal urbanization is that we have a lot of urban areas or poor urban areas, so-called informal settlements, sometimes called slums as well, interchangeably or with different connotations, which the UN Habitat defines as places which lack improved water, and sanitation, without sufficient living area, durable housing, secure tenure, or combinations of these different deprivations. So this is a key component and the main goal of SDG 11.1 target in particular, which is to end these slums and to promote urban inequalities. So this is a challenge I've been looking quite closely with how this is reflected and how can this be supported in data in different facets. So just here a glance of some of the work we've been doing in the Institute for Global Sustainable Development. We have an ongoing portfolio of projects which are exactly addressing this context that I just described, addressing the problems of urban informality and urban resilience, and how to tackle this with data. So we're looking at this, you know, just to give you an idea of breadth of things we are looking. We're looking at about floods, from floods in Brazil, which I will talk a little bit more in a minute, to landslides in Colombia and Brazil, and to healthcare access in Bangladesh, Kenya, Pakistan, and Nigeria, together with colleagues in the medical school, looking at digital mapping as a means of connecting maps of urban informal settlements in Ghana, Kenya, and Nigeria with automated and AI techniques for remote sensing processing, and very glad to include here also our ongoing collaboration with MSDI and the Citarum River Program and MADA as well in the water and river pollution in Indonesia, which we are building upon a seed funding project and looking to expand. So this program of research speaks to this to this central problem of looking at how can we think of data in different ways. How can we look at data in different ways to empower local communities with data, and then to allow a more kind of like inclusive development and empowering modes of resilience. And I would like to specifically talk today about the project, that was too quick, about a project called Waterproofing Data as a case study, which we started uh, 2 years ago, about 2 years ago. So we're going towards the third year. We called it Waterproofing Data provocatively, to think about data and flooding, and to think about making data waterproof, or making data or use data to try and make us waterproof or more water sensitive. How I think I loved it, the word as well is used in Monash. So that was the provocation. So how to use this data. So we took this challenge, really, how to rethink flood data. What is data about flooding? How is it produced? How does it flow? And we thought of using this to think about how this could really enable transformations to flood resilience. And we are having in this project here 2 case study cities in Brazil, very different ones. So one is, as you know, Brazil is quite a big of a country, and we have one of the kind of like perhaps one of the largest cities in the world, and certainly and the largest in Brazil, São Paulo, with 12 million inhabitants. And we took a very contrasting case of a city called Rio Branco, which probably you haven't heard of, is in the Brazilian Amazon, actually, in a state called Acre, and has a population of 320,000 inhabitants. So it's really literally very close to the border with Peru and Bolivia, and literally in the middle of the Amazon. And interestingly, both are very affected by the problems of flooding in different ways. So we thought this could be a great case to look at flooding in 2 contrasting cases. So the waterproofing data takes an approach which is really look at 3 different challenges here in terms of methodological challenges. One is how to make visible how different stakeholders engage with data today. And then we are looking at different methods for doing this. A method called data diaries is one of them. We are engaging citizens to produce, circulate, and embed data, and we are using a couple of different methods I will talk a little bit more about, which are digital flood memories, data-driven installations, and citizen science. And we are looking at integrate data from citizens or citizen-generated data with other sources to support policy decision-making. So in this diagram, you can see that we are working in 3 different scales. So one of the approaches for us to think about data is to think about how data is used in the different scales here that are involved in the problem. Here in this case, in communities, local governments, and centers of expertise. I think there is usually in the data world a focus on the centers of expertise and on the centralized decision-making for resilience. We look at this, but we would like really to see how this relates to the other levels and how much the data is flowing between these 2 levels. Looking at this contrast between some top-down narratives here on the right-hand corner, between the big data of the centers of the expertise and the bottom-up narratives of citizens and their lived experiences with flooding, and how to make them more visible. So this is the kind of like overarching structure that we called to look at risk and resilience as co-production, or as looking at co-production with stakeholders as a means for looking together in this structure here. And there is an underlying approach here, which we draw from the critical pedagogy of Paulo Freire, who is a Brazilian educator, who became quite famous, I think, in the 70s with a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And his pedagogy is very influential in Brazil, but it's also very useful, I think, pedagogy to think about data not only as a means of in an epistemological lens, but to think about data in a pedagogical lens or in a critical pedagogical lens. What Paulo Freire brings us, I think, is this concern, is this sensitivity to look at the context. You know, he started looking at literacy programs and how actually to make them closer to the oppressed, to the people who are really on the ground, and saw a disconnect between things that are brought in terms of education and the realities of the people. And I think we see a disconnect between data many times and the realities of the people. So we're taking this approach to say we have to reframe data generation as also an opportunity of learning, and that includes using this lens of a critical pedagogy of Freire. And we are looking at what we call the generative data. What is the data that really makes sense in the community and creates what Paulo Freire would call a critical consciousness, or creates a different reading of their territory. So this includes really looking at the data generation, which is usually thought as a means to an end. But we take data generation very seriously. We perhaps, see data generation as important as the data itself, because it's an opportunity for capacity building and learning. So how we are doing this in the waterproofing data, we are doing this using different methods. We are doing this, for example, including elderly people looking at digital flood memories of how to make the stories and the experiences available in digital flood memories. We do kind of like methods of oral history to register this and digital flood memories. We do collaborative mapping to put, literally some of these informal communities are completely off the map. So we work to really bring them to create digital maps of those communities and then be able to represent them. And we do kind of like risk perception mapping, really, work with participatory mapping to define areas of hazards together with the community. And this involves facilitating a process that really looks at how, for example, make sure that some of the perceptions of the community are translated into more formalized data. And last but not least, we use citizen science and artistic installations, especially with youth members, and we are now developing a mobile app to go with this approach with the schools, so that they can be citizen scientists and also kind of like register data about flooding, which goes from registering even rainfall gauges, which might be might be perhaps self-evident in some places, but in some places having access to timely and very granular data about rainfall is not that easy. If you think of Brazil and the size of Brazil, that has more than 5,000 cities and a lot of variability in the rainfall. Even data from things like radar, they aren't as granular as they could be, and then that means that actually the methods developed for are also biased towards areas for which we have more data. So in a way, democratizing the production of even the meteorological data can be also very important. So with this sort of different methods, we are trying to really improve the database of flooding. The database both for the systems themselves, but also for the authorities, in this case, for the flood early warning system. And interestingly, I brought an example here of what I was talking about in terms of the approach of using data generation as an opportunity for learning. A very interesting quote, I think, that we've heard in one of these exercises on risk perception mapping. Someone from the community, from one of these informal communities, is called Mboimirim, which is in the metropolitan region of São Paulo, and has about, I think it's about 300,000 inhabitants, only this kind of like district. of the huge city of São Paulo. So it could be a city itself. And they say that, you know, doing this kind of mapping, doing this exercise, in this quote, they say, change the way they are seeing flooding. Oh, this was too fast. So I'll go there in a minute. So, and actually what I found interesting is that, you know, they said flooding for us was what we saw in the television. So they didn't connect their realities to the problem of flooding and to the problem of risk. So it was really interesting, because when we arrived there, they were like, oh, we don't have flooding. But then we knew that there was flooding, and there was a big problem there in the neighborhood. But then they said, like, no, now I understand actually that we can do something about it. So it's not only about too much rain, it's about, you know, factors of vulnerability that cause flood risk. And then now I see that flood here is a critical case, and then we didn't have this vision before. So I think that is an example of using this data as a means of the changing consciousness. So with this, I will conclude with some takeaways now with this example. So the first takeaway, I think, for us is to look at this kind of like citizen data generation as a transdisciplinary problem space. And I think that is what we're seeing here. We are looking at flooding both from not a environmental science point of view of producing data on rainfall, but also as a social science point of view. But more than this is a cross between this kind of like a sphere of the science and of SDG monitoring and of, you know, official resilience building and community development. And I think, you know, the challenge here lies in finding connection points between these different worlds, and perhaps really defining new methods that at the same time get the data in the completeness, timeliness, consistency and scalability that we want, but also empowers, allows for multiple perspectives, and enables social learning and conscientization, which is a word from Paulo Freire, which is the, you know, development of critical consciousness. So that's what we call the challenge of generative data. The other takeaway is that usually we think about data for transformations to sustainability, really emphasizing usage. You know, if you look at the report I started with from the SDG report this year, is really talking about data for monitoring SDGs, which is the use of the data to monitor SDGs. But I think we develop here an expanded perspective that actually data can be used for transformations, not only in the usage of the data, or the usage can help transformations, but also the generation, as I just said, you know, can be an opportunity for transformation, as the circulation of data, which is the connection between the actors through data. These three can also be opportunities for data. So we have to think about the role of data a bit broader than usually is done, focused in only on the epistemological and decision making and the support for decision making. And my last slide, and some reflections really for the future of data production and what we're talking about here. I think when you talk about data and SDGs, the challenge starts with the framing of the problem, really. You know, like it's actually who defines which data will be collected and how data will be measured, who define the issues is an important topic before we just kind of like drop into collection of data. And I think we've seen this quite a lot in our approach, which is, you know, the need for connecting to local problems is also a need for allowing for new methods that allow people to define the data they need, but at the same time connect this data with other perspectives and other scales. I think that is the twofold challenge we are talking about here, which needs for this necessitates transdisciplinary research methods. We need methods that connect these multiple disciplines and real world challenges, really. And the other one is like, you know, there is a big, as I started, you know, there's a big push for smart cities and smart areas and smartness, but I do think that we have to really be careful in its smartness with spatial and social inequalities. So inequality is a big challenge to take seriously when talking about digitization and talk about smartness. And we need really to think about territorially sensitive digital transformations or digitization, which is really sensitive to the territory, to the society, which lives there. And last, I think I try to convey this key message today in this talk, which is to show you our perspectives is that data generation is an opportunity for social learning and empowerment of citizens. So, but at the same time, we can do this whilst at the same time generating high quality data to inform public policy and SDG monitoring. I think that's the key kind of like challenge. So I've seen quite a lot of initiatives that do community initiatives and community data even, but this data is not in a standard or in a format that is recognized by authorities. So it has one component, which is the community development, but not the other, which is the the flow of data as evidence for decision making in other spheres. So I think the challenge is really how to combine both, and that's the idea of the intersection here. And that for this we do need to think about co-production of methods, of data products, and co-design of innovative ways of really thinking of how to bring these digital technologies to processes and to bear with local realities here. So these were my key messages. Many thanks for in this late of the evening staying on with me, and I'd like to stop here perhaps, and if we have time, Rob, open up for some questions.
Sure thing, João, and thank you so much for hopefully not skipping your breakfast, but maybe having an early breakfast to talk to us. I think that was great. That was a very insightful overview of all the different kinds of projects and honing in on a few specific ones with more detail. So thanks a lot for that talk. I would like to open up the floor for any questions and comments, and feel free just to to turn on your microphone and ask a question. It's a fairly small group, so we don't have to over manage that process.
I've got a question.
Yeah, Claudia, go ahead.
Thank you so much. That was a really fantastic presentation. I actually also work in AI on the side in flood prevention in East Timor. And I'm really interested to ask how you include people with disabilities and vulnerable people within the community empowerment framework or model that you implement.
Many thanks, Claudia. Great to hear. I do think that's a big challenge. How to be inclusive in the methods. Like I think that's a big challenge. One thing that we do, quite a lot is to think about the digital as a moment, and then to think about digital and physical as a continuum. So, like I work quite a lot with maps, as you've seen some pictures, we do print maps, and then people annotate maps, and then we digitize. So this turns into data and to digital later, So, and I do think that, it's too much to ask to think that we will develop, only the kind of like latest mobile app with full-fledged features that require the latest smartphone to use, like that will be difficult. But, in a lot of the informal communities I've been working, a lot of people have smartphones, but not the latest generation one. So it's a matter of designing for this. So, people with disabilities, we also had this, like we had to think about some, when coming to the field really, to be sensitive to how do you design specific methods to cater for the different parts of the group of the social groups who are in the territory. So I think that this is how we've been approaching. So really thinking about a variety of methods for a variety of groups, like thinking about, for example, using paper maps for people who are less digitally literate. You're using kind of like, different that I think we didn't have we do have a strong group in one project I'm doing in Brazil, a strong group working with sign language for people who have disabilities, specifically hearing disabilities. I think that this is another thing we've been using as well, and again, like there is a group specifically working at how can design technology to be more inclusive in that sense, and include the Brazilian language of signs as one of the kind of like multi-language components of the research. So this is, you know, in short, try to perhaps think about different methods, you know, and different modes so that we can really be inclusive when working with communities.
Great, thank you. Obrigada.
Obrigado.
I would also like to ask a question, if it's okay for me to go next. Also, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this presentation, and I think it's really fascinating how you're bringing the different approaches together. My own background, well, mostly during my PhD, was working around risk communication, and I found there's such big differences between, you know, how experts define risk and then how the public or members of communities perceive risks. And I think it's fascinating, these processes of, you know, participative processes of generating data also raises these questions around definitions of risk and well-being and equality and all these different things, which, you know, once we have the data, it all looks so objective, but, you know, how we actually create those definitions, there's so much in it. I think it's really fascinating. My question is about something different though, but you mentioned, you know, that there is this lack of data, this huge gap basically, and there's so many different types of technologies, digital technologies, and different types of data that exists. What do you think is the most potential, like what data or what technology has the most potential for sustainable development? You know, like for example, I heard people talk about that there's a lot of satellite data that is actually not being really used currently, but which could, you know, help us understand where deforestation and other problems happen. Yeah, I don't know, I'm just interested, like what do you think will be interesting to focus on in terms of technology?
Yeah, many thanks, Celine. I you know, indeed, a lot of this different perspectives of risk and resilience is something I'm really very interested in, central in a lot of my projects, indeed. And I feel like my experience is very similar to yours. You know, talking about what is risk in the community, it becomes very different. And thinking about what is data for risk, you know, in the community, really make people think about, you know, what is data, you know, what is flooding data, you know, like that was a lot of this question here, you know. Flood data, is flood data only rainfall gauges? Is flood data only kind of like, you know, hazard maps, official hazard maps? What is flood data? You know, is only hydrological, meteorological data, or is also data about, you know, how many people have disabilities and that are affected by flooding, you know, or about the lived experiences on flooding? I think that is, you know, I'm starting with this because I think this indeed is important to think about which technologies, you know, like which technologies can offer us which data, you know. I do think that for, you know, we have a lot of interesting new developments that open up many different perspectives for us. I think the remote sensing area, you know, satellite imagery is becoming much more granular, much more accessible. You know, we have in the EU the Sentinel data now. We are exploring quite a lot in projects. You know, you definitely will see much more with satellite data, you know, and be able to talk much more about environmental features as well. Of course, there is even the more kind of like extreme cases of satellite data with the planet and others, you know, optical imagery, which is really even capturing not the environment, but capturing social activity with satellite data. So this is also became possible with the super granular, you know, meters, some meters resolution. That's also like definitely interesting. Of course, has also strong raised strong questions around privacy and about how actually to be careful about this. This is something I spoke less about today, but it's the other side of the data, which is, you know, the privacy issues and all the kind of like misuse and control through data and data surveillance, which is also a very important question to think about here. But I think, you know, I'm looking at this complementarity between this kind of like more environmental data and the more social data. And I think in the social sphere, I think the citizen generated data is the thing that for me is the most attractive new technology that opens up and democratizes data production, as I said. So I'm excited with this potential and challenge, and also like with the dangers that it opens up in terms of really exposing people. But I do think that this is another technology that, you know, or a set of technologies, you know, all of them, from social media to apps for citizen science, up to maps, crowdsourced maps that everyone can use. All of these technologies around citizen-generated data is another source. So I think, you know, this I would say, you know, these are some which I am particularly interested. I do think that data innovations in general is something we have to we'll have a strong focus on, you know, in the several senses. But these two are ones I'm mostly focusing on.
João, can I ask a follow-up question on that, on citizen-generated data? You mentioned in the beginning of your talk this sort of what was it called, information DAS, the Janus face challenges of data, and one of the challenges is around low integration into decision-making processes, and that sort of triggered me a thought. Some of the examples I've seen back in the Netherlands around citizen-generated data, one around cycling-generated data, so people just downloading an app and generating information about how to travel through cities, and that was supposed to inform planning processes to make better urban infrastructures for riding in this case. Another one where people could buy for fairly low price a small device to monitor air quality, and later on also a device to monitor or to measure radiation for nuclear power plants. Both citizen-generated process or citizen science project, but they had challenges in terms of, not in terms of generating the data, but becoming influential and actually changing some of the practices, you know, actually changing some of the urban planning practices. Or in the case of the urban, in the case of the radiation data, you know, mainstream data organizations arguing that this stuff is, you know, it's not precise enough, it's not good enough for us to make decisions on. So there's sort of legitimacy issues, I guess, around citizen-generated data. I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on that from the projects that you've done.
Wonderful, Rob. Yeah, I think that's a central question indeed. You know, actually this question about whether the data can be used as evidence, you know, whether the citizen-generated data counts as evidence, you know, and who defines the standards for evidence, you know, is really very important. I agree with you. My experience is very similar, you know. So like there is some excitement about citizen-generated data, but there is also a big problem, which is, you know, usually a lot of, you know, frequently, let's say, a lot of the official agencies see citizens-generated data in a very instrumental way, which is, you know, okay, so I need this data, I will procure this data with the citizen and they will produce for me. So it's usually not the case. And also, if you do it like that, you don't have the empowerment and the kind of like the learning aspects actually. But then if you have the empowerment and learning, you know, this data sometimes doesn't match. Sometimes it's you know, it's the legitimacy is questioned through technical quality, you know, or using the language of technical qualities. And, you know, the data is not qualitative good. So, you know, that doesn't adhere to the standards that I am expected to see in the data. We have the same problem with the flooding data, right? So if citizens produce this flooding data, how can this count as evidence for example, for thinking about risk, for you know, for influencing risk planning, urban planning, you know, and risk planning, for influencing flood early warning, really, you know, how can this be counted as evidence, really? How can we? And I think I took this as a methodological challenge. And the way I usually approach this is really to work with both groups from the onset in the project, really, if to work with planners and with the, you know, with the users in the government, and work with the citizens at the same time. And it's not always easy, but it's about finding the intersection. You know, it's like it's not everything that citizens are interested that will interest governments, and it's not every data that will be useful for the citizens themselves or for the communities themselves that will be used by the government. You know, but we can try and find the interfaces and the intersections. And usually it is possible to find intersections, you know, like in my projects, for example, the intersections are, you know, the flood warning, early warning agency, they are interested in rainfall gauges, really, because, you know, rainfall gauges are, you know, something they can use on, even if it's not perfect, we can design processes to say, okay, how can we make it regular? So we embed it in the school curriculum. We do training with the students and they kind of like helped shape this curriculum, and then they have a bit more confidence in this data that will be generated. It will be checked later as well, and that's to be seen. But they have more confidence in the processes of data production as well. But at the same time, we do this and we work with communities, say, okay, you will generate this data which is of interest to governance, but you can also generate data that is of interest for you, for your employment, for your community. And I think that's the kind of like negotiation process we usually do.
Thanks, João. There's a question right there, and I see Andrea, you're also raising your finger. So first, Darren, try to keep your questions. Sorry, Andrea, maybe try and keep your questions and answers fairly short. So first, Darren, and then Andrea.
Thanks, Rob. And thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. Just quickly to let you know, we're working on a project here with colleagues at Monash in the context of a net zero precinct, which is in development. And we're actually looking more at, I guess, how to democratize data governance. And working with various stakeholders in and around the precinct at Monash in the Clayton campus to understand how we could test a process for how what we're calling precinct citizens could co-design but also co-appraise various data governance prototypes. And given your focus on co-production in a lot of your work, that sort of brings up, in my mind at least, Elinor Ostrom's work. And I wanted to know if you've had much thinking or practice to do with Ostrom's work, both understanding data perhaps as a common pool resource, but also from a governance point of view, how to look at polycentric modes of governance and what that could look like in terms of these data communities.
Thanks, Darren. That's really very relevant. I'm more and more interested in this. Perhaps co-production has at least two senses here, isn't it? Like in the more the Ostrom tradition, like co-production of services as kind of like citizens and governments co-producing, there is, this big tradition. And I think, we're talking about this as well, and we are talking about co-production perhaps in a specific way in research as well, which, the co-production in the research project, which comes to the kind of like to the more the participatory action research and citizen science ways. I think we are working in the intersection of both. I do think both are very interesting, and the data governance angle is a very good one. I think data as commons, definitely. I see data as commons as well.
Thank you.
Andrea?
Yeah, thanks. Well, your talk reminded me very much about work done by a very small NGO in Guatemala, and they're using an app called CoMap, which is generated more in Mexico, and it's more in that area of Latin America. So I was wondering, how much do you kind of collaborate with those NGOs, but also that same CoMap organization works with Techo, which is an NGO that is also present in Brazil called Teto. So how much does your project or the project you're involved with communicate with those people that are doing similar things that could help each other?
I think like the short answer is that we'd love to I'm fascinated by these grassroots data innovations, and definitely, super interested in connecting to them. I do think that what perhaps we can help or how we can work together in research is really to think about processes that connect the grassroots with other levels as well. I think that is a challenge I've seen. A lot of the grassroots data innovations, they keep into the grassroots levels, really. Like they are difficult to scale and not only scale up but out, really. Like really to move to different levels. And I think specifically about Techo and Tetos, I'm really interested. I'm starting to talk to them and work with them, hopefully next year, definitely. So I think there are exciting opportunities there to look at how we can connect these different, the different practices, grassroots practices, really, with this more digital technologies and thinking about data standards. Thanks for this.
Thank you. We got perhaps time for one more question.
I would like to ask something.
Yep, Eric, go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks, Professor João. The presentation was fascinating, and I was particularly interested because I'm also Brazilian, so I know São Paulo very well. And I'm doing my PhD, almost finishing, under Diego's supervision at Monash, and we are working in RISE, this very big project, but I am working particularly in a flood monitoring program that used WhatsApp. So people were sending me photos of gauges through WhatsApp. And it is really interesting and very similar to what you were describing. My question is kind of a follow-up from what Rob asked. How do you deal with the legitimacy of the data in the academic context? Because in decision-making, you can bring both to the table, but I have some trouble even to justify the validity of my data in a PhD context, in publications. So I wonder, how do you deal with funding bodies, with governments, and with academic colleagues? How do you justify the value of a community perspective of water?
Thanks, Eric. Great to hear about your work, and glad to catch up then at some point. So I do think that this is a challenge that has been perhaps, perhaps I'm seeing a trend of an opening, of the kind of like of the research processes, very recently, if you see like some of the large kind of like, research funding bodies have emphasizing more and more transdisciplinary approaches, and have emphasized more really kind of like co-production as trying to kind of like mainstream this a little bit more, in the, especially in the sustainability area, I think in particular. But I do think there is a trend or there is a movement of trying to make this more systematic and more common. Indeed, but I do agree with you. There's still a challenge, especially if you think about, I think there will be differences in the different disciplinary traditions. If you think about the barriers of academia, really, the different disciplinary traditions will perhaps look at the data differently. I do have like very similar experiences that you are telling when, I'm working in the waterproofing data with people who are really, hardcore meteorologists. And some of them really like, have raised big eyebrows when we're talking about the citizen generated data and doing data with schools and, using WhatsApp, it's something we are using as well. So similar methods that you use, some of them initially are very skeptical. There are two ways of getting around that. One is, first, co-designing, as I said, so really bringing them in, but of course you can't bring everyone, have to bring perhaps a sample and then hope that this will scale up. But one thing I usually do is to put it to the test, really, to do quality assessment, really, like using their standards. Sometimes, when we do design the project, we include a component which is really, okay, so let's collect this data systematically. Let's have one area in which we are more data rich and we can compare the existing data very granular with this one. And then we'll test, and then we'll have like at least some evidence that these methods here work. I think I use this as embedded in the research component quite a lot, which is to say, you define quality in specific ways. Let's have a specific component to do quality assessment, really, from your perspective. There will be other perspectives on quality of data, but at least in a project, sometimes I try to accommodate it like that. So that's one of the strategies.
Thank you very much, João. And I think we have to round it up here. People might be wanting to start their evening, and you might be wanting to start the rest of your day. But it was great having you in this seminar series, and I'm really looking forward to maybe even have you live in the future, hopefully also in Melbourne. So we're working on that, and thank you very much. And thanks everyone for joining us at this unusual hour. Have a good day. Cheers.
Indeed, thanks everyone. It was really great. Thanks for the questions. Thanks everyone. Look forward to the next steps.